Test, 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 test. I'm assuming we're all good. All righty. Test, to test, test. I'm going to slide through, y'all. Oh, volume's over here. How about now? Better? Test. Faye, can you hear me in the back? Yeah, I think it's better. All right. Can you hear me? All right, good. I don't have my bell. I forgot my bell. Ding, ding, ding. That's right. So, oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to do that one. Nobody pay attention to that. Yeah, tell you. Do it again. Yeah, I didn't bring my bell, so I got it on a. So, all right. Good morning. Welcome back after a long summer. Couple of announcements. Betty Hips is still sending out the email, which we're glad that she does do that. At the same time, we're going to the email. You should have received an email. I think it was either last night or this morning about prayer requests. And you come to give me a hug?
No.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah,
So I won't go in front of you.
that's all right. You go right ahead. So I thought you were coming to give me a hug. Yeah. So That's all right. But I'm also going to send around the prayer pad, so that'll go around here in a few moments, and she'll compile them both and then probably send them out maybe Wednesday morning or afternoon. So thank you to Betty again. So I'll give Becky this. Then I'm also going to pass around the refreshment list. So if you would like to sign up for refreshments, we have at least this fall. And then the last thing, or last handout, I've passed this out in previous Old Testament lessons. This is one of my professors at Asbury, Lawson Stone, who is from Statesboro. He compiled this, and this has been probably the most helpful map, or at least some type of breakdown, or at least something visual to see what it talks about, or what the Bible talks about in the Old Testament, what that looks like, and how that, what empires is it a part of, and things of that nature. And so obviously the book of Daniel would be sort of right in the middle of this. Daniel deals with, obviously, the person Daniel, but also the southern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah. So if you are looking at the map, it's going to be the left hand in that middle section where it says the history of Israel. It comes down, but when it splits, you want to stay to your left. And that'll give you an idea about, at least some of the things that took place in order to eventually get us to where we'll be in this particular study. So Teresa, or if you're at home, I did not give this to Teresa, so for that I apologize. I'll give it to her, and she'll, I'm sure, find a way to, if you're at home and you want to look at it or maybe download it, maybe I'll get Kathy to scan it in, and you can get it in the form of an email. I do want to welcome those who are with us at home, and hope that you're doing well at the same time. Before we pray, so how many of you have ever studied the book of Daniel and its completion? 1, 2, 3. All right, so we have 3 experts. Everybody else, no. So if you don't like the book of Daniel, you can blame Mimi, because Mimi said she wanted to study the book of Daniel back in May, and so here we are. What I want to do this morning, we're only going to meet for an hour, not our normal time, mainly because of some events here at St. Paul this afternoon, or at 2 o'clock with Trip Wade's funeral. So I'm going to need a little bit of time to get ready for that. So we're going to meet till 11, and then we'll break, and then, of course, we'll meet back at our normal time next week and sort of get into the middle of it. What I want to do today is give you a ton of historical information. So it's going to feel a little bit like a history lesson. And so we're not even going to get into the text, which is, it's helpful for us to understand some of the components of the book of Daniel, to know that on the front end, because that'll help us when it comes to our understanding when we actually look at the scriptures. So you're more than, you don't have to take notes. Just got questions, raise your hands, but I need to go through just a lot of information to help us get ready to actually jump into the text for next week. So Daniel, the name actually means God is my judge. And Daniel was captured or deported when he was about 15 years old. And he stayed in Babylon his entire life. He died around 85. So for about 70 years, Daniel is in Babylon. And so he witnessed so much, not just of what was going on in Judah's history, but he also was there at the height and the fall of Babylon. Outside of maybe Pharaoh or the pharaohs, Nebuchadnezzar is the most influential non-Jewish ruler or leader in the Old Testament. He's a very important figure in the Old Testament, very important in just history in general, because basically under his hand, Babylon becomes what it was historically speaking. And it was a major powerhouse for a period of time. And Daniel witnessed all of that and was a part of Nebuchadnezzar's government. And at one point, we'll get into that he had a very influential place under Nebuchadnezzar. So basically what we're looking at is this period of 605 BC to 535 BC. That's Daniel's, pretty much his time, his life, and then his time in Babylon. If you have a study Bible, and I think some of you do, some of your study Bible information, at least in the beginning, normally study Bibles work a couple of different ways. At the beginning of each book of the Bible, they'll give you maybe a couple of pages that talk about the date, that talk about the theology and things like that, or might talk about the author of the book. Some study Bibles put it all on the front end, and then you have maybe some commentary at the bottom of the Bible. Some study Bibles put it at the back end of the book. But at some point, you're going to run across who is the author of the book of Daniel. Was it Daniel? Was it someone else? The overwhelming evidence is that it's Daniel, the historical person. There's a minority view that wants to attribute the book of Daniel to the Maccabean period in the intertestamental time between the New Testament and the Old Testament, or between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That an anonymous Jew wrote it. That's pretty far-fetched. I've mentioned to you in the past that I'm so grateful for those who do PhD work. But PhD work is founded on you have to survey all the information and come up with something that's new. Well, something like Old Testament or New Testament writings, well, they've been around for a long time, so it's hard to come up with something new every single time. And so sometimes you get these views where it's maybe some obscure writer or something like that, probably so they could get past their PhD boards and exams and then eventually get their position. But the overwhelming evidence is that Daniel wrote it. Historical person Daniel, taken captive at age 15, lived 4/5 of his life in Babylon. A large portion of that is under Nebuchadnezzar and then some of the other kings. What's interesting to me, and this is not just me, but others, is that the New Testament operates with an understanding that Daniel wrote the book. And it's not even open for question that somebody else might have been a part of that. Jesus obviously quotes the book of Daniel, and in Matthew 24:15, Mark 13:14, also in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. Don't worry about these passages. You'll when you read the Gospels, something will trigger in the back of your mind that'll say, "Oh yeah," because he actually quotes about the desolations, and he's a verbatim quote from the book of Daniel. So, for Jesus in the New Testament, there's an assumption that Daniel, is the historical person here, and that Daniel received these divine revelations, at least the latter part of the book, when we talk about chapter 7 through the end. And then Jesus quotes directly from the book of Daniel, and Jesus saw them as future events. And this is the only view that is subscribed to by the New Testament writers. So the idea that there is an anonymous or obscure person in this intertestamental period is pretty far-fetched in my opinion. I mean, it's just hard to kind of give evidence to that when the majority of scholars and then also the New Testament has a view that Daniel wrote the book. Now, that might not be that big of a deal to you, all right? So, but for some, it is. Well, yeah, I would argue that's not a bad thing to hold on to. But for others, like Isaiah has multiple writers, and that's pretty common. Now, the person Isaiah wrote the majority of it, but if you look at all the things that Isaiah talked about from Isaiah 1 to the end of the book, I mean, it sort of follows well over 100 years. So it'd be the idea that one person wrote all that, probably not. So, but for Daniel, pretty easy to draw the conclusion that it's just one person. What's interesting about the historical events, and this is where we need to sort of kind of pay attention to, Daniel pretty much is taken captive around 15 years old. Josiah is the king, and Josiah is a good king for a while. So this is before Daniel's taken captive. And he ruled for a pretty long time. He did a number of reforms. He's considered as a good king, but he died in 609 BC. and his son Jehoaz takes over. Now, this is 2 King 23, the beginning of I think it's like verses 1 through 6 or 1 through 8 or something along like that. But 3 months into his reign, he is deposed by Pharaoh in Egypt. And Pharaoh sets up a puppet king, Jehoiakim, and this is also in 2 Kings, the latter part of chapter 23, in the beginning of chapter 4. And Jehoiakim rules for a little bit of time, not much, for about maybe 3 or 4 years. And eventually, Pharaoh is defeated. Now, this is an important day in history at Carchemish, because this is pretty much the end of anything that has to do with Egypt in some level of influence. Now, you think back to Moses. Obviously, Pharaoh was probably the most powerful person in that period of time, but with the Assyrians, not so much. And so Egypt's rise and fall after, say, the Moses time period, there are just some ebbs and flows with it. But after 605 BC, you pretty much don't hear anything about Pharaoh, or at least Egypt. So this is a big deal. If you're, in Egyptian history, this is sort of like the end of it all. And he's defeated. He's defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar at this time is not king. Nebuchadnezzar is a general under his father who is ruling Babylon. And this is the rise of the Babylonian Empire. There obviously, if you were to look at some of the events in that period, you've got Egypt still some level of power. Babylon's over here, Iraq, that area, and they're starting to sort of flex their muscle. Well, it all comes to head at 605. And in 605, the Babylonians defeat the Egyptians and some other people that are along with it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar pretty much wipes out Egypt and then begins to invade Judah. And so this is the beginning of the downfall of the southern kingdom. Hadn't happened yet, but it's on its way. In about 20 years, they'll be gone. So 605 is a pretty important date in the life of at least leading up to Daniel and things of that nature. When Nebuchadnezzar invades Judah, which is the southern part of Israel, the southern kingdom, Daniel and a few others are taken captive. Now, this is one of 2 captivities, or at least some level of deportations. But this is what Daniel talks about in Daniel chapter 1. When we get into the passage, the very first couple of verses, Daniel's going to talk about this. Now, it's general statements, but this is what's going on. So he's taken captive. The other ones are taken captive as well. And Jehoiakim is actually still, it's like a puppet, some level of rule, sort of in paper only. But eventually, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar removes him and puts up a different king, Jehoiachin, right? So you got to get all these names right. Jehoiachin. We need to get John in here to talk about the Hebrew differences of like 1 or 2 letters, right? So, but Jehoiachin is placed over as the ruler of Judah, sort of as a puppet leader for Nebuchadnezzar. And he's there for a while until eventually he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Well, when that happens, Nebuchadnezzar pretty much has had enough of it, and he lays siege to Jerusalem, and it takes about 2 years for him to eventually conquer Jerusalem. But when he lays siege on Jerusalem, he takes this is the second captivity or the second deportation, about 10,000 Jews. And they're all young males, okay? And they would have been around the age of about 13 to 15. And the reason why is when we get into the text of chapter 1, and definitely chapter 1, what's documented in non-biblical writings, at least in the Babylonian writings, if you were to go in and research that, is that Nebuchadnezzar had this indoctrination type process that where he would take young males, the best and brightest of an area, and he would bring them to Babylon and pretty much put them in the brainwashing formula. And so for years, they would be indoctrinated to the Babylonian way. And he did that for other areas that he conquered. He definitely does it for Judah, where anybody that had some level of promise, and there's not like a standardized test, basically if they were tied to a family that had some level of leadership or power, whatever it may be, he would take their sons and deport them, and then they would go through a 3-year training period, and if they made the cut, they would be absorbed into the Babylonian wheel of leadership and government. If not, they pretty much were killed. So, you either got to it or, adios amigo, right? So, so there's one level of where there are some that are taken when he invades Judah, when he's had enough of it, and he basically destroys the temple. So this is where Solomon's temple is destroyed. All right, some of you have been to Israel, and what you see is the remnants of the temple that's there now. That's not this one. This one was a pancake. What you see is when they built it back, but they pretty much he destroys the wall. He destroys the temple. Not quite as bad as what the Romans did. So the Romans in 69 A.D. it's a pancake, but they do lay siege to it. They burn it. They destroy it. Fiddlesticks, who's that other guy? Oh my gosh. He leads Ezekiel comes back, and then he also works with, who? Nehemiah. Yeah, Nehemiah, thank you. You get an A for a day. Who was that? Gene, there you go. Yeah, so now we have 4 Old Testament experts, right? So we have battlefield promotion. So Nehemiah is born at this period of time, and he eventually leads the people back. And one of the things they do is they rebuild the wall, and then eventually they rebuild the temple. But Ezekiel, Zedekiah are probably 2 of the more famous individuals that are taken during the 597 siege. During the siege, Nebuchadnezzar puts a new king up on it. We really don't know that much about the new king. But he rebels after about a year, and they're all just then they're all just died, and he pretty much just destroys it and says, I don't want to deal with them ever again. And so 588, 587, 586, depending on different scholars, but in that period of time, Jerusalem's wiped out. So a lot going on. I mean, you can somewhat follow this in the Kings, 2 Kings, like 20, 22, 23, 24, and you can get some insight of what's going on. But it's good to read those, but you want to read them with some level of maybe like a historian that can tell you about some other stuff that's going on outside of just the kings of Judah. But Judah's wiped out. Now, the northern kingdom has long since been gone. They were destroyed by the Assyrians. So, but this is the very end of basically Israel's some level of, they're pretty much from here on out, Judah, because after the Babylonians come the Persians, after the Persians become, eventually I think you have some of the Greeks, and then you eventually get the Romans, and then you get to Jesus. So that'll give you an idea of what's going on. They'll never really have autonomy after this period of time. So, well, until what, 1948 or whatever. So, but anyway, this will give you an insight into all the players that are starting to sort of manifest leading up to our study in the book of Daniel. So, a couple things about Daniel. Daniel, the book is divided into 12 chapters. It's really 2 parts. The first part, a lot of historical information that we're probably most familiar with, because that's the easy parts. That's what takes place with Daniel. That's what takes place with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's what takes the fiery furnace, the lion's den, all the things that lead the diet, things like that. All that stuff is played out in chapters 1 through 6. When we get to chapter 7. That's where Daniel introduces visions. Now he has some visions. The others have visions, but this is where we get to the apocalyptic type visions. all the stuff around the Son of Man coming in the clouds. So that might ring a bell. Now, apocalyptic writing or genre, that style of genre, has a couple of components to it. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about the book of Daniel or if we're talking about Revelation. Those are the two major books. There are some other books that has that level of genre or writing, but they all have these same characteristics, all right? And so, and they're fairly simple as in the characteristics, not necessarily simple to understand. These features, the first is that there's some level of revelation that's given by God, that God is the author of it, and the revelation comes through a mediator, whether it would be an angel or a messenger, or whether it would be Jesus himself. Hey, how y'all doing? Oh, you're good. So, but there's some level of a mediator that gives the message. So you can. So have y'all read? Have y'all read the book Daniel yet? Not yet. Okay. So, but you do have that level of a messenger gives the vision. Now there's debate over whether or not it's Jesus or the angel. There's it's almost like splitting hairs. But there is a mediator that is used, and it's given to someone who's normally a seer, a prophet, or whatever it may be, and the message is about something in the future. That it's at least some level of a future event. This is a little bit debated because there are some people who interpret apocalyptic writings that it's talking about the current time. It just uses a bunch of symbolism and numbers and things of that nature as a way to encourage the people. So in Revelation, you have a new emperor, and the new emperor has inherited a kingdom that is broke financially. And so there's nothing to unite all the Roman people. So one of the ways that they would do this, what previous emperors would do, is that they would unite the entire empire by going to war. All right, so war has a tendency that can unite an empire or a nation into one common goal. And so in the book of Revelation, previous emperors would do that to unite the empire, get them kind of all on the same page. But here, in the book of Revelation, the new emperor doesn't have any money, so he can't go to war. So the next best way for him to unite the empire is through religion. And so what in the book of Revelation, what he did historically is he created emperor worship. Now they had emperor worship to some degree in the Roman sort of theological world, but it always came after the emperor died. What this new emperor did in the book of Revelation is that he created emperor worship, and we're going to do it now. And so he did this massive building campaign where he was going to build basically some level of altars or churches or whatever you want, some building where his image would be in the building, and every Roman citizen had to come and do some level of some aspect of worship, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 times a year. If not, then they would be subject to persecution, or either financially or physically or whatever it may be. So there are some who think that with the book of Revelation, John on Patmos is writing to the church using this style of genre to encourage them in this time of persecution where you have a new emperor basically saying, you got to worship me. So there's a little bit of debate about this, and some of your study Bibles might talk about that. But normally it has at least, whether it's talking about a current time period or talking about a future time period, it definitely uses future tense to describe it. Because not only does it use future tense, or not only does it talk about future events, or at least paints them that way, but it always stems from a time of persecution. So whether we talk about in the book of Revelation or whether we're talking about here in the book of Daniel, both are in a period of persecution. Obviously Daniel's been deported. A number, Judah, Jerusalem has fallen. This is definitely a time of persecution, and and normally involves visions or dreams, things of that nature. And so you have those not just in the book of Daniel, but you also have them in the book of Revelation. And they always have symbolism. And which is why most people find reading apocalyptic writing difficult to understand. Correct? I mean, how many of you sign up to read the book of Revelation all the time? And I mean, every night you read the second half of the book of Daniel, correct? You just go to bed just thinking about it. Yeah, it's just light reading, no big worry. Yeah, so, but there's symbols, there's numbers, and if you think about the Old Testament, there's a ton of symbolism in the Old Testament that is used in the New Testament, but it's definitely used in this style of writing. So you have to get your mind in an Old Testament understanding. Definitely the symbols, definitely the numbers, because sometimes the numbers in the Old Testament are literal, sometimes they're not. So 40, 70, 3, those numbers, we context is the best clue that we have in trying to interpret them, but even then, we don't know for sure. For instance, like Genesis uses 7 days. All right, so is that 7 literal days? Or is it just 7 periods? Or is it just trying to give a complete period, a complete description of what creation looks like? Well, again, you got a PhD project. There you go. You can interpret that however you want, because it's all over the place on where people, you got your literalists and you got those that are not. So, understanding the symbols can be kind of difficult. Because one of the symbols that is used is this idea of a conquering king coming down from the clouds to a place. And so is that literally descending from the clouds? Or is it the symbolism of what it's like for a returning king to return home and be received by his citizens? So how many of you have seen the movie Russell Crowe's in it, Gladiator? All right, you remember that movie? It's been a while, all right? So there's a scene, and maybe I'll have to find it. We'll show it next time. There's a scene where the emperor is coming. He's riding into the city, and so the people are going out to meet him. And what they do is they go out to meet him, and then they all come in. It's receiving their conquering hero, and so that's the symbolism, or that's the literally what took place. So is that symbolic of Jesus as a conquering king coming down to his kingdom and being received by his people? Or is it a symbol of rapture? All right, so we don't know. All right. I argue the former, not the latter. But I'm not, somebody else believes differently. This is not that big of a deal either way. But that's where some of the people get the idea, or at least the understanding around rapture. And a lot of times they'll quote either something from Revelation or they'll quote something from Daniel. But the symbolism is actually something that took place in that time period whenever a king would return after being victorious. Well, they would go up to meet him. They would go out to meet him. And so you get the same thing here. But the central message, and this is why apocalyptic writing is always seen as something of encouragement, is because the message is that in the end, God triumphs. So whether you're reading the book of Daniel, whether you're reading parts of Ezekiel, definitely Revelation, the end product is that God wins. And God wins really without a struggle. And you'll see that as we get to the latter parts of our study in this book. You definitely see it in the book of Revelation. There's all this build up, leading up to Armageddon, at least in the book of Revelation. And then you turn the page, and it's like it's already over. It's like, what happened? Where's round one? It's like, no, it's already, you missed it. You blinked your eyes, and it was over. And so God wins, and God wins without even breaking a sweat. And so that's why apocalyptic writing is very important, definitely for people in times of persecution. Because the writer reminds them of a day that this struggle will be over. And the struggle will be over because God is going to move and God is going to act. All right? So let me just stop for a second and see if there's any questions about just the characteristics or the features of this style of writing. Because the Bible has different genres. I mean, you don't read the book of Psalms the same way that you read the Gospels, right? I mean, so how many of you got your Bibles? I'm going to turn to Psalm 109. I think it's 109. So John and I are going to be teaching on some of the Psalms on Wednesday night supper. But this is one that I think it's 109. I hope it is. If it's not, we're in trouble because this is just off the cuff here. This is not in the notes. Yeah, so hang on. What I want you to do is I want someone to read. Let me just make sure it's the right one first, all right? So I want someone to read part of Psalm 109 because this has got to be the funniest psalm around. Okay, yeah, all right. So do me a favor. Somebody read verses 1 through 5. This is actually really, really good. All right, so this is the setting in Psalm 109. Somebody's been dealt a rough hand by his friends or enemies, whatever it may be. He has set them up as this, Lord, this is all the things they've done, but yet I'm a man of love and a man of prayer. Did you catch that? All right, so then someone read, begin in verse 6, and let's go to verse 15. Now, so this is what he's actually going to pray, all right? So somebody read 6 through 15. So tomorrow's prayer, this is going to be our guide. And so, I mean, what are we supposed to make of this, right? I thought the Bible, what is this even doing in the Bible, right? I mean, so obviously, we read different parts of the Bible according to the style of writing that they are. So what's so great about the book of Psalms is that they are an expression of human emotion and human experience. Although we might not write this down in a formal prayer, there have probably been times where you have been so angry you have wanted this, or so hurt, or so betrayed, or whatever word you want to associate with that. So this is not necessarily, obviously we don't teach this as a model prayer, but it does give you a form of expression that in life, even those that are considered followers of God, they don't get a free pass. And so what do? Do you just deny it and pretend it doesn't happen? Well, okay, but normally when that happens, your body either mentally or physically starts to break down. And, so finding expression, even expressions of anger, can be therapeutic. And obviously God is not, he's not embarrassed or ashamed, or God's definitely not running from this. I mean, this is actually, it's in the canon. It's in one of the books. I mean, and listed in the book of Psalms. So so my point though is this: there are certain parts of the Bible we read differently because we know what type of genre it is, And so when we read this, we don't go, oh my word, let's rip it out. We just say, no, this is the psalmist being honest. Now, we might read in a couple of Psalms later on, maybe he's repentant. Lord, hey, forgive me for all that over there. I was in a bad place. I felt like, or when the psalmist says, I feel less than dirt. All right? That's depression. All right? So, it's not like the Bible hides itself from that. It just isn't. It's part of the human experience. It's part of it is an expression of human emotion. So when we read this, we're not taken back by and go, "Oh my word! We can never even talk about this ever again." No, we just kind of When we read Psalm 1, that's a little different. We read Psalm 109, Psalm 23, other psalms, things like that, and we just take them at face value for what they are, for their style of writing. Apocalyptic writing is a different genre. So, we just have to spend a lot of time trying to parse what's the meaning here. Does it have more to do with this, or does it have more to do with that? For those over there, does it have more to do with the current time or the future time? And we, the context can be helpful, and we parse through that as best as we can. But it's just a different style of writing compared to some of the others. All right, so let's just, again, I said I was going to answer any questions. Anybody have any? I didn't even give you time to ask them. So, are any questions about any of this so far before we get into actually some of the major theology of the book of Daniel? All good? It's kind of like a fire hydrant. Yeah. So outside of the four experts that we have in here, so here let's look at, and this will be our last little part. Let's look at some of the theology of the book of Daniel, because this is going to show itself in a host of different ways throughout our study this year. The overwhelming major theological theme in the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. That there is nothing that is beyond God's hand. There's nothing beyond God's awareness. And you can't read the book of Daniel and not see it dripping on every single page. If you ever want to study a book around God as sovereign, the book of Daniel is probably the best. I would argue it's at least a top fiver. It's on everything. In the first 6 chapters, it's God is over every single kingdom and all this that's going on, and then the stuff that takes place in the first few years of Daniel in Babylon. Nothing is beyond God's hand. From 1 through 6, he's orchestrating all of this. Even the beginning of chapter 1, it even opens with the idea that God has delivered the kingdom of Judah to the hands of Nebuchadnezzar for things in the past. 2 through 5, you got the chapters 2 and 5, you've got God delivering basically under the idea of granting favor to certain people who are followers compared to others. Chapter 3, famous chapter, fiery furnace. That's a great chapter to study. You'll see that that you actually get Nebuchadnezzar going, wow, your God is better than our gods. And chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, one of the visions that he has a dream and it troubles him, and basically it's the idea that Nebuchadnezzar ends up spending a number of years sort of as a crazy person, out eating grass like the beast, and it's not until he acknowledges God's sovereign does he actually sort of find himself again. So all this is at the hand of God is over all of this. Eventually in chapter 5, there's a judgment on one of the latter kings of Babylon. Chapter 6, rescued from the lion's den. I think that's probably the story we know more than anything else because of VBS and children's studies and things of that nature. And then 7 through 12 is where we have this style of writing, but behind it all is God's sovereignty. God is over not just this area, God is over all of the kingdoms, because in the end, God will triumph over all the kingdoms of the world. So sovereignty is all over the place. as as just the major theme of the book. Now, there's some other themes. You obviously see God's love and care for his followers. And in this book, God's wisdom and power is illustrated more so than, say, justice. So you got other books of the Bible that have to do with the justice of God. Think Malachi, think Amos. Those are some of the themes. But here, it's just straight up God's wisdom. God is the giver of wisdom. Daniel's able to understand things that other people are not, all because of God's care. You definitely see God's power in how things are orchestrated. And then the last theme is you have the beginning of this idea of Messiah. And so Messiah means anointed one or chosen one. And what shows up in this is, at least in some form or fashion, the first and the second advent of the Messiah. First advent is what we know about in the Gospels. Second advent is return of Christ. So both of those are alluded to as in the book of Daniel. So there might be some other smaller themes, but these are the main four, with this one being the most dominant one. All right, so that's the so Joanne, was it the Bible Project? Is that what it is? Where they do the little Yeah, so this is actually a neat, I forgot who's the sort of brainchild behind this, but one of the things that they do, it's like a YouTube video. It's called the Bible Project. They take every book of the Bible and they give you, a thumbnail sketch as fast as they can do it, and they're, sort of like delayed drawings. And so if you want to get the book of Daniel in 7 or 8 minutes, go to the Bible Project, and just, you can probably type in the Bible Project Daniel. Bible Project, and just put Daniel, and it probably shows up that video. And if I was on my game, I'd have brought my computer. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So Joanne has now been promoted to IT specialist for the Tuesday morning Bible study, and she'll be making her rounds throughout the months. So as you sign up for refreshments, just put what day you want Joanne to come by and show it to you. What I'll do is let me make myself a note, and I'll get Kathy to send out the link. And so then all you have to do is click on it. And then there was something else I was going to ask Kathy. Oh, Kathy, to send out this if you would like a copy at home. So, copy of handout. All right. But it's a good book to study, and it is helpful. And this is one of the things I've enjoyed as I've done some work ahead of time, is that in all things, God is still at work. And it's easy for us to get like the Psalm 109, where we're just sort of just caught in either a situation or just kind of in the knee deep of something. And obviously, what's helpful is to see a larger perspective, and that's always a voice of encouragement, and it can also be a voice of help and comfort. Because it's easy for us. I mean, I think all of us would agree that there are times in our life, we get tunnel vision, where we become very myopic, and that's not a negative, all right? So it's just part of life in general, where you go through something and it's all consuming. And one of the ways that can, be helpful, or at least can help us as we work through that, particularly like with grief or levels of sadness, is to just, not to deny that what we're going through, but at the same time, just, all right, let me just kind of see if I can expand my vision for just a hair, or just for a little bit, to see something larger than just what I'm going through at this particular time. And then to know that God is at work, and God is in the middle of it all. Even, obviously God is not taken back by the rawness of human emotion, or the rawness of depravity that exists in the world. He doesn't run from that. One of the temptations that I think we always have to remember is to resist the temptation that it's our job to clean up either the Bible or God or whatever it may be, as if to present, if it's not presented in just this nice, perfect package, that somehow that's going to be offensive. Well, I mean, that comes from maybe a good place, just not real. I mean, there's nothing that's taboo in the Bible. It's talked about it all. We just don't want to read those passages. I mean, you can't make a movie of the Old Testament because it would be rated like quadruple X. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, we read the stories that are nice and we clean them up, but you can't even read the book of Genesis. You can't even get through basically after chapter 4, it all turns to pot. And, and from then on, it's just human depravity, one event after the other. Yeah, I mean, guess what? It's the same things in the church, right? So the idea that the church is going to be this perfect place does not exist. It exists until people show up. And then, I'm serious, and then when you open the door, guess what happens? Well, there it is. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so, it's like when someone says, I don't want to go to church, it would be hypocritical or whatever. I was like, well, that's where all the hypocrites are. We're all, welcome to the club. I mean, we're in the process of holiness. Wesley would say we're going on to perfection. And that's a process. The sanctification is a process-oriented event. And it's my experience is that God has a tendency, or the way God works, is obviously there's the macro redemption story of how, what God has done in Jesus Christ. For that to become micro is the macro has to sort of process through every micro event of your life. You with me? The larger story of what it means to be Jesus as Lord and what resurrection truly is, until that's experienced first person through separate events in an individual life, it always stays just in an objective level. And so I think the Holy Spirit waits for us to have these Psalm 109 experiences. And then it wants to redeem each one of those. And from that, then our life grows. And so to some degree, there's no growth without hardship. I mean, you don't know you don't know the power of faith in God until you get to a place where faith in God has to be exercised. If not, it just becomes something that we talk about, but it's not something that is first person. So when that happens to you, so some of this you already know. You've lived a life that has this is already part of it, but don't run from it. So accept it as what it is, and be open to what God can do in the process of all of that. Now, it takes time. I mean, obviously, it's not something that's one day and then the next day it's gone. But in the process of all of that, God is still working. And so you'll find the book of Daniel spans from Daniel being about 15 years old until he's 85. He's writing about the entire time of the heyday of the Babylonian Empire. So it's about 70 years. So, I mean, we just turn the page and we think, oh, this event, this event, this event. No, there are years in between one chapter to the next. But in the process of that, I mean, Daniel seeks to remain faithful, and at the same time, God is with him in the easy and in the difficult. And so I think that's why this book is a good one for us to study. Doesn't always work out for him. He's not spared the lion's den. And they're not spared the fiery furnace. And when we get to chapter 4, chapter 3, one of the best verses in the entire book is when they're asked, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are asked, and their response is, whether or not he saves us, it doesn't matter. Now, I'm paraphrasing. We're just not going to bow down. I mean, so think about that. So what that tells you is the insight into their psyche and what they were thinking, that sure, God could. Whether or not God does, well, that's up to him. So we're not thrown into the fiery furnace thinking, oh, yeah, it's all going to be hunky-dory. Now, they're thrown in with the idea of like, hey, we could easily burn up here pretty quick, about 7 times hotter than normal. And, so that's an interesting verse that's worth some meditation on for sure. All right, so tonight when you see the link, you'll realize that the link did a better job than I did. So they did it in only 8 minutes. I did it in 50. So, but any comments or questions or just some introductory thoughts that that you might have before we move into next week, jumping into the passage? Yeah, it's a good book to study. For the first few weeks, at least 6, maybe 10, maybe to Christmas is not a problem. In the winter, that's where we have to put our thinking caps on and jump into the deep end of the pool. So, all right. Yeah. So there's a comment that Becky made that obviously in the 500 BCs, obviously it's a noteworthy story, but it's still pertinent today. And so that's I think where the Bible is a little different than anything else, is that it has this ability to kind of transcend time and space, and what God is able to do with that is able to break into our time and space and make it first person for us. All right, all good? All right, well, go in peace. May the Lord be with you. See you next week.